Hey, are you tired of the left and right politics? I hope you'll subscribe to my YouTube channel. Just click that subscribe button, ring the little bell, and prepare to free your mind from the traditional red versus blue. Question: should vaccination be required for all military? Can it be required for all military? I get there by walking through four different headlines. The first of them is this: just a couple of days ago in the New York Times, and we talked about it on May 3rd, the day that it first appeared. More than half of adults in the United States have been inoculated with at least one dose of the vaccine, but daily vaccination rates are slipping. And there's widespread consensus among scientists and public health experts that the herd immunity threshold is not attainable, at least not in the foreseeable future, and perhaps not ever. That's headline number one. Headline number two, I put it in the mix because I think the subject matter is related in terms of where I want to go. This is from the Washington Post on May the 2nd. Police officers were among the first frontline workers to gain priority access to coronavirus vaccines, but their vaccination rates are lower than or about the same as those of the general public, according to data that was made available to the Washington Post by some of the nation's largest law enforcement agencies. By way of illustration, Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, just 39% of employees have gotten at least one dose. That's compared to more than 50% of eligible adults nationwide. Atlanta, that number among law enforcement is just 36%. Columbus Division of Police, which is Ohio's largest police department, the number's 28%. You'll recall a headline that we discussed in mid-April. It was from CNN. The story said this in the lead: nearly 40% of U.S. Marines, declining the COVID-19 vaccinations, according to data that was provided to CNN by the first branch to so disclose service-wide numbers on acceptance and declination. And then finally, headline number 4 from Just Security, and this will take me to a special guest: should COVID vaccines be required for the military? Mark Nevitt is the author. He's a former naval officer who served as both an aviator and attorney in the Navy, recently retired as a commander. He's currently an associate professor of law at Syracuse University College of Law. Professor, thanks so much for joining me.
Great to be here. Thank you.
As someone with military service, what thoughts do you have as to why the number of service personnel in comparison to adults generally would lag behind in terms of getting vaccinated?
I'm not quite sure, to be frank, Michael. I think there's an element of leadership and public health communications that has to just spread throughout the military. That the message seemed to be lagging in certain spots, particularly Camp Lejeune is one of the Marine Corps bases mentioned in the study earlier. And so I think it's really a leadership and communications issue right now, and making sure that all of the service members get the right ground truth information about the vaccine and its effectiveness.
I can't help but link it to law enforcement, though. That's why I tossed that headline into the mix. And I wonder if the same mindset, it's a good thing, a mindset of service. I mean, there maybe is a common denominator between the person who wants to be in local law enforcement or the individual who has served their country. Maybe they overlap and they've done both, but I don't know. There's something out there that distinguishes these folks from the rest of us in terms of not getting vaccinated.
Perhaps I do think it's a little bit too early to tell on the DoD, the Department of Defense uniform vaccination numbers. General Austin mentioned that all the vaccination would be available to military service members May 1st. So the next week or two, I'm going to be looking at the vaccination rates and where that stands vis-a-vis other parts of society. It does seem there's a little bit of vaccine hesitancy, but I think in the military, you have tools that can overcome that through leadership, communications, incentives to get that rate up.
Last Friday, President Biden was interviewed by Craig Melvin for the Today Show and said that he's giving serious consideration to the issue that you're here to discuss, and that is making it mandatory. Question: can military members be legally required to receive the COVID-19 vaccination?
Ultimately, the answer is yes, they can. Right now, all the different COVID vaccinations, Johnson and Johnson, Moderna, Pfizer, under what is a emergency use authorization. And so what that means is that each service member still gives his or her informed consent prior to taking the inoculation. But the president is authorized under law, Michael, to waive that informed consent and making it effectively mandatory for all military service members. It's the president's decision ultimately on how to proceed.
In other words, right now you need informed consent. You need to explain the risks and possible complications and get the consent, the acquiescence of the person who's getting the injection. But the president, in certain circumstances, can overrule that. What are those criteria or circumstances generally?
So the law is very unclear on that. It just says in the interest of national security and has to be done in writing. And a good example I like to provide is the influenza vaccine, which is not an emergency use product. It is something that is fully FDA approved. That actually is a mandatory vaccination for all military service members, punishable under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which means if you don't get a flu vaccine, you could be subject to military discipline. So the president does ultimately have this authority for the COVID vaccines. Just remains to be seen whether or not he actually makes that national security determination.
How much of this, if any, has to do with the current status as the 3 vaccines that are being utilized permitted under an EUA, an emergency use authorization?
Well, that drives the informed consent requirement. And so I think if it was fully FDA approved, the issue of making a waiving informed consent sort of goes away as a legal matter. And you could theoretically make the COVID vaccine mandatory, just like the flu vaccine.
Do you expect that the military will do so?
So in terms of making the COVID vaccine mandatory?
Yeah.
So, so ultimately, it's the commander in chiefs again. So the military can't get out ahead of the commander in chief, the President Biden, on this to make it mandatory. That would raise a whole host of issues and open up the military to litigation, I would think.
In other words, you think that if the president were to move forward, and he hasn't said that he would, just that he's giving it serious consideration and he'll evaluate it going forward. But if he were to make that move, you think there'd be litigation and ultimately he might not be successful?
No, just to clarify, if President Biden does in fact make a national security determination that the COVID vaccine is mandatory for the military, I expect General Austin and the whole entire military Department of Defense apparatus to follow that and implement it across the Department of Defense, not unlike the anthrax and smallpox vaccine that was done, 15 or so years ago.
Right. But if I'm in your old job as a naval officer and I don't want it, are they going to be successful in making me get it?
If the waiver of informed consent is signed by President Biden, yes, they will be successful. That will be upheld by military courts, and it'll be upheld under any federal court administrative challenges.
Professor Nevitt, is there anything to be learned from the anthrax experience?
Somewhat. I think that initially there was not. The anthrax and smallpox vaccines, which I actually received when I was an aviator in 2003, that was issued under an analogous sort of emergency use authorization. It was called an IND, an interim use authorization. And many military service members actually received that vaccine and challenged it. But it was ultimately upheld in military courts under courts martials if they were punished for a violation of an order to not take the vaccine. But federal courts actually had a much different take, Michael, in that they actually issued injunctions at time against the military for not following all the procedures in the anthrax and smallpox vaccines. And I think that makes the military very, very weary of getting too far ahead of the president on this matter. They'll look to see the president make that actual national security determination.
And finally, and maybe most importantly, do you have an opinion as to whether this issue, the lagging behind by a certain number of military personnel in comparison to adults generally in getting a vaccine, is it impacting our military readiness?
Somewhat. I mean, we saw that with the Theodore Roosevelt a year ago when there was a COVID vaccine outbreak on an aircraft carrier. We saw a couple Navy ships that were stopped their deployments in Fifth Fleet, which is in the Middle East, a very important area of responsibility. I do think the military has done a pretty good job in mask wearing, social distancing. The military has followed COVID orders, and there's been only 25 COVID deaths in the uniform military from COVID. Of course, one death is too many, but that's relatively low numerator when compared to the denominator of the uniformed service members. So I think it's an operational issue, particularly for those deployed service members. And I think the focus might be there for service members that are in tight quarters about being a little more proactive on vaccination, making it mandatory.
Sum up, what do you want people to know about the issue of whether the military should be compelled to be vaccinated for COVID-19?
Let's look at the data to see the ground truth on the vaccination rates. That's number one. Number two, President Biden will have a decision probably in the next month or two on whether or not to waive the informed consent and making it mandatory. And I would hope that we will just follow the data and the operational impacts on making that determination.
As a naval tactical jet aviator, 290 aircraft carrier arrested landings. What's that like for the first time?
It's a long way from University of Pennsylvania, where I received my undergraduate degree. I'll say
paint the picture. I want to know, where were you and what were you seeing and what were you feeling?
So you practice the aircraft carrier landings quite a bit on what's called field carrier landing practice. You basically have a painted aircraft carrier runway on a field in San Diego, California. And the first ones are done in the daytime, and those are actually a lot of fun, particularly when the sky is clear and the sun is out. But it is basically like a controlled crash, and that does, even though you're in an injection seat and you're in a harness and you trained for it, you go from 130 miles an hour or so to zero like that, and it does. The first time you realize there's more to follow. The nighttime landings are a different story. And it's much more of a serious environment. I'll say it's a little bit less fun.
So when you were doing it for real at sea, where were you for the first time?
The first time I was just off the coast of Southern California, off of Catalina Island in Southern California.
Is there some kind of a naval drill routine custom when you've done it successfully for the first time? What?
So anyone, to include yourself, Michael, if you were able to get a tail hook landing, you could join. You'll be a tail hook member, which is the carrier aviation members, just for having a single carrier arrested landing. So you're part of that fraternity. So that's a nice group of people.
Good for you. Mark Nevitt, thank you. That was really great and informative, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Michael.